Welcome back to Feminism Concepts and Theories. Today we are going to go over another concept as promised. So I will give you a caveat here that for the next few weeks, this week, the next and the week after, we are going to go at this pace. But I would suggest you pay careful attention to each concept because right after that we will speed forward in figuring out how all of these concepts work together, conflict with each other and so on and so forth. So, in today's lecture, we are going to take up the concept of difference. And as ever, like we did with equality, we are going to look at models of difference in feminist theory. We are going to take two models as exemplars in order to understand how the landscape is configured. We are looking at Evans in 1995 and Barrett in 1987. Our goal in this series of conceptual understandings is to look at the co-constitution of equality and difference, and this will be an ongoing theme as we move forward in this course, which is how is it that each concept dovetails into the other and how we are building upon each as we build our basket of concepts. There will also be a brief introduction to post-structural feminist theory, and don't let the gigantic word bother you. I will try and explain it in as precise a manner as possible. But remember, as we move along in the course, you're going to have to keep adding to your vocabulary. I would strongly suggest looking it up, seeing varied sources, also keeping a dictionary on hand should any of these seem intimidating or daunting. But I promise you, as much as you might feel like a lot is being thrown at you in the first few weeks, it is also necessary for us to continue to remember that feminist theory is a vast field, and therefore what I am trying to equip you with is a basic understanding of how to read feminist theory. And lastly, we are going to give a brief reference to many forms of difference because as ever, a lecture is not enough to encompass the whole universe of difference. So, without further ado, what do we understand as difference in feminist theory? What kind of differences? Let's dive right in. Woman as different from man? Some would say obviously and some would say not really. Women as different than one another? Of course, but we are also looking at what kinds of difference between women, physical, emotional, spiritual, identity-based, so on and so forth. Multiple kinds of women as different than other kind of women, and here we are speaking about categorization, about how is it that we can then think about baskets of difference in order to compare and contrast. And lastly, very important, intersectionality to produce a spectrum or a plethora of differences. I may have said this before, so let me repeat. What do we mean by intersectionality? Intersectionality merely refers to the fact that gender is one axis of difference. It is intersected by race, caste, class, and therefore the particular kind of difference that is the lot of any individual depends upon where that individual falls at the intersection of these differences. And this has very much to do with our understanding of identity as a major player in the social sciences, which is why it never becomes unfashionable. So, if gender is an important category of identity, it is never very clear as to how gender will dictate differences just based on the fact of gender. In other words, if I ask you as to whether in a given context is a woman more at disadvantage than a man, it will also depend on the comparative race, caste, class of each of these individuals being compared. So, that again complicates our discussion of difference within feminist theory, which is what kinds of difference are more important than others, and very, very important, and this is why a lot of people may have a little discomfort in speaking about difference in relation to any form of theory that also seeks to produce change in the world, which is the moment you start arguing for endless difference, you're also arguing for the instability of a position. And let's pause. What do I mean by that? What is the instability of a position? Here I am referring to identity as a stable position. But if we are constantly speaking about gender as inundated with differences, with different kinds of genders, then who's the person that we are fighting for or the feminist movement is fighting for? If nothing is sure about gender, then how is it that we make a plea in the name of gender for equality? And therefore, the concerns of this concept have very much to do with asking, how can difference be deployed? And deployment is a term you will come across very often over the course of these lectures. It means that we are not making any kind of artificial separation between theory and practice. It means that in many ways theory exists to play. And I don't mean play in a light-hearted or frivolous fashion. It means that conceptually you can deploy something imaginatively. How is it that a concept like difference can continue to make a plea for equal rights? And equality is an imaginative question. You have to fill it with content depending on the context you are employing it in. So then the second question, how do we understand the schematization of forms of difference? Now, why are schema important? They are merely organizational tools for things to make sense to you. Meaning, you draw a scheme of various forms of difference and see how they are connected to one another so that you can continue to think about difference as a complex concept while at the same time not being worried that you cannot deploy it at all in a situation of asking for rights. How is it possible therefore to acknowledge many kinds of difference while continuing to struggle for gender rights? Now, this is a question that feminist theory and the feminist movement are fairly clear about, which is that you can't refuse difference. You can't collapse all manner of women into one category just because it is convenient. You have to hold together their difference while also allowing them to speak together as a whole. And this is a difficult concern, but both feminist theory and the feminist movement are adamant upon saying that this is something that has to be brought about at the risk of homogenizing differences into one kind of subject position. In other words, in whose name do we fight if woman is no longer a unified category? And this is something I was referring to a couple of seconds ago, which is that what is this category of woman? How is it that we outline it and detail its contours? So, these are the concerns within which today I am going to discuss difference. So, I say this again and again, which is that difference is one of the most important concepts that you will learn in feminist theory. I would encourage you to struggle with it for a bit and not to sit back and say this is not for me if some part of it is difficult or discomforting or disconcerting. Part of the mandate of theory is also to tell you that the world is a complex entity, and theory in its singular form cannot really allow you to grapple with it. It gives you a set of tools, but the work will have to be done by you. Let's start therefore, as promised, with Evans' schema of difference, which was written in 1995. Here, Evans details the three kinds of difference, starting with valuing woman's difference from man. And here this is a fairly commonsensical position to take. Women are considered different than men. But in what way? And the answer could come in multiple ways. So, the ones that Evans is detailing for us are the weak and the strong versions of cultural feminism. I will come to each of these in just a little bit. A is woman's difference from man, weak and strong version. B, differences between groups of women. This is not pursuing the idea of a singular woman versus a singular man and they are different. Instead, it's talking about how one group of women has very, very different sets of identity politics than the other, and thereby a different set of needs and a different set of demands. Lastly, we are speaking about the difference within. And here we are squarely in the realm of language and meaning, and this is where we will also be introduced to postmodernism and poststructuralism. Now, just a brief definition with postmodernism and poststructuralism, it might be essential to have a working knowledge of modernism and structuralism. But for the purpose of this lecture, it's really not necessary. So, I will offer a brief explanation in the next few slides. Let's start with the first kind of difference where we are speaking about woman's difference from man. Therefore, we ask, is the political task to valorize difference? And the word valorize is an interesting one, because here you are not only taking difference as something that is a given, you are seeking to make it heroic. You are seeking to add value to this question of woman's difference from man by saying that for centuries all you have said is that women are different than men, therefore their needs and rights are different. But such differences have led to marginalization of women. So, how about we do the opposite? We take it for granted that women are different than men, but additionally, we also say that such difference ought to be honored, it ought to be valorized, it ought to be made heroic. We have to pay specific attention to the details of women's lives in order to understand what kind of difference can be honored. And here, we are speaking about two kinds, weak feminism, strong feminism. Please remember, weak and strong over here are not value judgments, they are descriptors. They are descriptions of what kinds of difference are being made heroic in this process. Weak feminism focuses on women's values as being incorporated into the public sphere. Let me give you an example. These days, managerial traits are supposed to also accommodate understanding, caring, nurturing, being available to your team members in order to understand their plight in life. And this is what would come under the category of weak feminism, where you say women's values, traditionally what are considered to be only the purview of women's characters, the capacity to love, the capacity to nurture, the capacity to listen, these should be part of public sphere as desirable and necessary for the good of humankind. And therefore, weak feminism, or in other words, you might even call it soft feminism, which is, yes, women are exactly who you've always thought them to be, but let's bring those ideas about women into the public sphere and make them necessary to us. Strong feminism is, as the word suggests, strong, assertive, some might argue aggressive, primarily separatist in impulse, and here I know you are having imaginations of Amazonian women taking over the world, but that's not quite what it means. You reclaim women's values as devalued by patriarchy. You say that the things that have been dear to women have always been struck down by patriarchy. Think, for example, of the narrative of emotional women, women who are irrational, women who are capable of daydreaming at the cost of work that needs to be done. If you go back to a previous lecture where we spoke about the kinds of binaries along which concepts are organized, here women's values are considered to be unnecessary. Strong feminism not only reclaims these values but separates them, saying you have actively devalued them and we want those rights back. It is arguing almost militantly for a return of those things to public imagination and wanting to separate from men's values as defined by patriarchy. In our second form of difference that Evan speaks about, we are concerned with identity politics, where women band together based upon some common aspects of identity that they consider to be inherent to their sense of self. Here, let me separate between identity versus interest groups, which is that identity groups also are secured around identity, which is often defined in opposition to someone else. It's not merely enough on its own. Interest groups merely come together for the sake of some common interest that they share. Philately, fishing, reading, writing, so on and so forth, and these are often interests that they share rather than things that they consider germane to their capacity to being in the world. Here we ask, how does a unified identity mask differences within the group? Now you can see the kind of dialectic between the second form of difference and the first form of difference. The first was about differences between men and women and saying all women are the same. Here you are separating women into particular identity groups and then asking, well, all right, suddenly it's no longer woman as a single category, but if we have say 3 categories of women based on different identity characteristics, what about the differences within that group itself? Yeah? And how is it that those differences are not taken into account in this form of difference? In spite of this issue, identity politics does signify a wider shift in the meanings of difference. You're breaking down a singular category of woman into a couple more identity groups, and often the goal is for affirmative and group action, pleading for rights for the group instead of for a single woman as an individual deserving rights in the world. Groups are not equal to individuals, therefore they share characteristics and overlap with other groups. So one of the arguments made is that exclusion within identity politics, saying so and so are a group of women, must not mandate complete exclusion for other kinds of women as well. There must be room for inclusion, allegiance, affiliation and so on. And we still continue to ask the question, how does a unified identity mask differences within the group? But we bracket it. We leave it alone saying identity politics do achieve some functions, and this is a caveat that we must continue to pay attention to. Lastly, we come to the question of the case of postmodernism or the difference within, which is really, if you can see, it's a bit of a funnel. We start with woman as a large category, woman and man is a different one. Then we break it down and say woman and woman, there are differences, but all right, we'll deal with it by putting them into different identity groups. Third, the case of postmodernism addresses the previous question, which is, how does a unified identity mask differences within the group? Well, in order to consider that, what is offered is the case of postmodernism, where you suspect all narratives, where you say there is no such thing as woman really. These are words we play with. These are categories that are provided conveniently for the purpose of our easy living in the world, and therefore it offers a challenge to even something like identity politics, calling everything suspicious and a bit of a lie. It is a critical lens, and often the differences between postmodernism and poststructuralism are collapsed into one. So I'll speak about the difference a little bit, but I hope postmodernism is clear, because postmodernism is very much a certain kind of public cynicism and also a public amusement theoretically at the idea that anything can even have stable or clear meaning. One can think about postmodernism as a position. Now, something that follows from it is poststructuralism, which it would be useful to understand as a methodology to evaluate truth claims and understand the exclusionary operations that help establish said truths. The subject in this account is a process. Now, hark back to an earlier lecture where we spoke about this kind of construction of discourse, that it's only through discourse, things said again and repeatedly from multiple quarters, that any category begins to take on the location of truth. Poststructuralism is a method to unravel such truth value. It asks us to evaluate truth claims. Like, for example, think about people saying a woman's place is in the kitchen, right? So we're not saying that is obviously false, that there's a problem in that, it is patriarchal. Instead, we ask, who are the people that believe that a woman's place is in the kitchen, right? Then you ask further questions. You say, how is it that you believe that? Who told you? What are the kinds of scientific knowledge, cultural narratives, religious narratives that have allowed you to believe that a woman's place is in the kitchen? So, post-structuralism really offers a constructive method for us to be able to understand how something takes on the nature of reality. And this is why post-structuralism is in many ways not the same as postmodernism. And this is something to remember as we go forward to investigate the question of difference. So, let's do a quick recap. And here I am only going to go over Evans' schema of difference. Let's start with difference 1. What is a school of thought? It's a woman-centered school or cultural feminism, if you remember, in which we are talking about how we have weak and strong versions of cultural feminism, gynocentrism or gynandry. The form of difference that it advocates or looks at are differences between men and women. What's its standpoint? Where does it look at this problem from the point of view of two main schools? Different but equal. Women have complementary virtues to those of men, and that is why they ought to be recognized and pulled into public imagination. Rebut, refuse, attack all that is man-made. Women's difference is superior. Remember the maternalist stances that we spoke about? This comes at it from a similar school of thought. What are its politics? Belief in some kind of universality or commonality of womanhood, that there is something essential to being a woman that is shared by all women across the universe. Some illustrative feminists to read should you be interested: Mary Daly, Adrienne Rich, Carol Gilligan. Difference 2. What is the name of the school of thought? This is fairly obvious: identity politics. What is a form of difference that this school embraces? Differences between groups of women in terms of identity categories such as sexual preference, race, ethnicity, country of birth, so forth. Again, I will emphasize that identity groups are different than interest groups. Standpoint is that feminism is based on an over-homogenized white women's experience, which means that they are critiquing a form of feminism that takes on a universality. And the universality in this case is not the universal male subject, it's the universal white woman as the neutral subject upon whose experiences all of feminism's activities should be based. By introducing identity politics, this is also speaking about intersectionality and saying there are different kinds of women in the world and their interests are completely different than those of white women and should be heeded to accordingly. What are the politics of this form of difference? They are based on religious practice, ethnic identity, sexual preference, etc. In other words, the politics that one associates with identity, namely identity politics. Illustrative feminists are people like Iris Young as given in this schema. There are other feminists who also practice very interesting, vibrant forms of identity politics in relation to women's issues, and we will visit some of them in our week where we speak about the 3 waves of feminism. In the third kind of difference, postmodern/poststructural, we are concerned to deconstruct dualisms and fixed identities. In other words, we are deconstructing the very category of woman, thereby also bringing us to the risky proposition that feminist politics cannot be practiced in the name of any kind of identity. And here, while the table says that all views are equally good, the right way to phrase this would be that in postmodernism, all views are equally suspect, and in poststructuralism, you are interested in asking how is it that something that is a good viewpoint began to be seen as good or true or right. Group representation is a problem as it calls into question the category of women. Here, illustrative feminists are Judith Butler, Joan Scott. Now, we will speak about Judith Butler a little bit in this lecture itself and then again in the weeks on queer theory and poststructuralism. So, if poststructuralism doesn't make enough sense to you right now, just hold on for a few weeks. By the end of the course, it will. Let's move on now to Barrett's schema of difference. This was propounded in 1987, so many years before Evans, but there's a reason we are taking it afterwards. It's also because the categories in this collapse and expand upon Evans' schema of difference. Here Barrett is concerned with difference as experiential diversity. Again, we are coming back to the category of the human, and we are saying the difference can only be based upon life experiences, and therefore the author is interested in experiential diversity of unitary human subjects, where gender is part of that difference, but it's not the only one. Difference as positional meaning. Discourse, textual difference is created through oppositions. Here in the second form of difference, we are squarely in the realm of postmodernism and poststructuralism. Barrett's first category of difference collapses 1 and 2 in Evans. Barrett's second category of difference equals Evans' third category of difference, and to this Barrett adds one more, which is the question of sexual difference, which has then gone on to gain interesting directions within feminist psychoanalytic theory, where sexuality or sexual difference is central to women's oppression, and gendered subjectivity means that you reclaim the unconscious from that kind of training of your sexuality. I will not go much into it in this lecture, mainly because it is a bit of a dense and difficult topic at this stage, but we will revisit it again in queer theory. So, to recap a couple of questions with Barrett's schema of difference, school of thought, difference as experiential diversity, where differences are both differences between women and men and differences between groups of women, because all of it can come under the category of experience. It rests on the view of the unitary human subject who is an active and effective agent. Does this remind you a little bit of liberal feminism as we discussed? The idea that every human is an agent and acts within various sets of constraints, and thereby these actions are to be taken into account to understand the need for feminist intervention. And there is a confidence in empirical methods and an ontological reality. By ontological, we mean lived, everyday, day-to-day acting reality. Its politics are about a recognition of diversity of social experience. Now, remember, when we say ontological, we are talking about people's experiences in society, both between women and men and within groups of women. Now, this is a fairly sort of all-encompassing, generous category of difference because it does not exclude anybody. Instead, it insists on difference as absolute and of difference as an ongoing process. To that extent, it might share some kinds of similarity with the idea that the subject is very much a process. But what it does not share is a clear analysis of the categories of discourse that bear upon the subject as they live daily life. Illustrative feminists Mary Daly, Adrienne Rich, Andrea Dworkin, Dale Spender. In Barrett's second category of difference, we are interested in difference as positional meaning, very specifically within linguistic difference, language and discourse. Here the standpoint is deconstruction of the unified subject of humanism. You have to reject all grand narratives, and there is a challenge to transcendental meaning. It is a dismantling of reality. So, you can consider this to be a combination of both the postmodern and the post-structural point of view. And its politics are very much textual and local, meaning its intervention is located in dismantling any kinds of assumptions in writing and reading and the ways in which meaning is constructed in the world. Illustrative feminist could be Angela McRobbie. And lastly, sexual difference is interested in the creation of gendered subjectivities through accounts of sexual difference. It is looking at the centrality of sexual difference to women's oppression. Now, this is very much also rooted in questioning schools of biological determinism that say, well, here's the bodily empirical evidence that women are different than men because sexually they are just oriented differently. Each is oriented towards the other if you're looking at standard heterosexual constructions. Here, theorists interested in reclaiming the unconscious also look at liberating that kind of sexual imagination from these constraints. And you're looking to read Juliet Mitchell, Luz Irigaray, Julia Kristeva, Melanie Klein, Nancy Chodorow. I also want to introduce you briefly over here to Joan Scott's scheme of difference or equality, where she importantly argues that difference and equality can coexist. And we are bringing together our previous lecture on equality along with this on difference when we say that difference in relation to sameness is not the same as equality and inequality. You can have difference and sameness within one particular set of thoughts in relation to equality. Just because you're perpetuating differences doesn't mean that you will automatically perpetuate inequality. And this can be brought about, she argues, by a deliberate indifference to specify differences. In other words, A, B, C are different, but it doesn't matter. You don't assign a hierarchical value to differences. You don't say so and so is short, so and so is tall, and therefore tall is greater than short. You just say it doesn't matter. It just means in different circumstances, these can take on different valences. And the task of society is to ensure that whether short or tall, the opportunities, conditions and outcomes available to each are not different or superior or inferior. And at the same time, Scott argues that there is nothing self-evident about difference. She goes one step further. She says not only can difference and sameness be accommodated within the same understanding of equality, in fact, let's question difference itself. How is it that difference comes into the world? She argues that the kind of hierarchical difference upon which inequality rests is constructed. Let me add a note over here to say that every time you see constructed doesn't mean it's false. We are not questioning things like real or false. We think that even constructed things have force in the world. They have consequences. And therefore, when we say it's constructed, doesn't mean it's not enduring or it's not strong. It means that that has to be dismantled or deconstructed. Now that we have come to the end of these two schemes of difference, it would be useful to outline our central problematic, which is that the ways in which feminist thought have been classified, you can begin to understand that there is no real consensus as to which categories are the most meaningful, how many there are, which writers speak to which. Often these are overlapping and it might lead to some confusion. It might be useful to remember that these are heuristic rather than empirical devices, which means they organize the world in particular sets of ways for your thinking convenience. They are not absolute truths in the world. And just because there are so many categories doesn't mean that they negate one another or one is more superior to the other. It just means that they tackle different sets of things, and we all have to get used to thinking about all of them together rather than in silos. And some of these problems arise because postmodernism and poststructuralism are considered to be at the root of these concerns. How does one understand anything if the postmodernists think that nothing matters and if the poststructuralists think that everything needs to be deconstructed? Suddenly you think about yourself as forever drawn into these concerns and obsessed with them, which has given rise to a lot of memes about both postmodernists and poststructuralists. Just to give you a couple of examples, you will recognize the scene from Fight Club where it says first rule of postmodernism is you do not define it. Often people joke that it means anything goes, and this is kind of funny. But you have to remember that postmodernism comes in the wake of modernity, which is all about surety and rationality and definitiveness. And postmodernism was essential for the breakdown of these kinds of inaccurate sureties in the world, where the world seemed to be uncertain and breaking down. And the postmodernists came about and said, well, actually, the things that you think are certain are really not, and we need to rethink our capacity to be in the world. It performed an important imaginative and political function. Similarly, look at this meme about post-structuralism where somebody is calling a help center to say, is someone you care about getting involved with post-structuralism? And the woman says, my son has recently been using the term knowledge in the plural. Should I be worried? And the person says, unfortunately, this may be a symptom of reading Foucault. Refer to human nature in a conversation and observe your son's reaction. This is hilarious. But remember this, post-structuralism is powerful. Yes, it does teach you that most kinds of things in the world are unsure, that often we use them in a way that includes certain assumptions that ought to be overturned. But also imagine the liberty of a world where things are not sure, which means you can keep constructing them over and over again with a new set of assumptions that will hopefully lead us towards egalitarianism and equality. So, what should we know about these two terms? That issues of universality, subjectivity, power overlap. Universality is suspect. Subjectivity is considered to be formed by different sets of forces in the world that change over time, which is why the subject, self, is constantly in process, and both postmodernism and poststructuralism are interested in power. And power is not a bad word, it is just something that needs to be analyzed and looked at to understand how it acts upon subjects in the world. Postmodernism is a position, as we discussed earlier. Poststructuralism offers a set of tools. For feminist theory, it's particularly important because we're asking how women's lives are constructed in the ways that you see them to be constructed. It can also be considered as a response to critiques of Marxist certainty, where you said that once the class structures break down, women will be as equal as men, and that hasn't happened either with class or for women, and offers us the important possibility of creating a completely new set of gender discourses. And can you imagine how exciting that is? I know it's scary to a lot of people in the world, the idea that our genders are not certain, that of course there are men and women, and what will you know if you think that this truth has broken down? Well, I'm not sure. Poststructuralism also means that one has to give up one's attachment to constantly knowing all the time. Here it is also useful to do a little bit of a side note on Foucault, Michel Foucault, philosopher, thinker, influential figure who wrote and spoke about power. And to Foucault, power, as I discussed earlier, is a matrix. It's not a singular force. It comprises a set of forces that together act upon individuals and create subjects in the world. Foucault also argues that where there is power, there will be resistance. So, all is not lost. When we say power, we are not talking about something that cannot be fought against. Instead, poststructuralism also offers us the capacity to deconstruct in order to understand differently and thereby resist power. The operations of power give rise to self-surveillance. This is an important point for feminist theory, because then we ask the question, how is it that women themselves are not interested in liberating themselves? And the simple answer is, well, in many ways, women are also part of the same system as the rest of the world, and therefore you surveil yourself to try and be good subjects in the world based on the discourses that you are subject to. Lastly, as I mentioned earlier, power is both productive and repressive. It represses things, but it produces new things, and therefore it's an important force in the world to pay attention to. Reading Foucault is also really important to understanding post-structural theory, and here I want to give a brief introduction to another figure that we will read soon enough. Judith Butler, an important figure, an important writer in post-structural feminist and queer theory. I will not talk about what queer theory is at this point of time, this is merely an introduction. Judith Butler made her primary contributions in feminist literary theory and critiques received notions of both masculinity and femininity. So now we are in the realm of the third kind of difference, which is critiquing both masculinity and femininity in relation to Evans, and the second category of difference in relation to Barrett, where she says that binary theory should be replaced by a proliferation of non-hierarchical differences. Remember, Scott where we spoke about difference can be deliberately ignored as if it doesn't matter. Butler is speaking about the same thing in relation to gender and saying it's not just man and woman, it's different kinds of men, different kinds of women, and depending on how is it that they are located along the spectrum, we can create multiple categories of gender that need not be hierarchically related to one another. Most importantly, and we will revisit this soon enough, but I want you to remember it at this point of time as an important way to understand difference by deconstructing gender. Butler argues that gender does not express anything fundamental about men and women. There is nothing intrinsic to us called gender. Gender is fluid and gender is performative. Now, what do we mean by performative? Does it mean that we are all tricksters in the world, that we know some other truth and then we emerged and says, okay, let's play man-woman, let's play woman-man, let's play, act and perform these things and fool the world. Pay attention, the word is performative, not performance. Therefore, what Butler is arguing in relation to gender being performative is that subjectivity in the world is formed through performance. Discourses around us tell us what men and women ought to be like, and we are informed that we are man or woman based on biological characteristics at birth, and then we repeat what we think to be the ideal performance of masculinity or femininity again and again and again until it begins to seem natural and part of us. In other words, there is no intrinsic understanding of gender that one should have allegiance to. One should get used to thinking about gender as performative, and maybe we can perform differently, or perhaps maybe even stop performing. And therefore, she reads texts like Kafka's Before the Law and says that the anticipation conjures its object. We anticipate that somebody is going to expect us to be gendered in particular fashion, and even before that person expects us, we perform it. We walk in a certain fashion, we speak in a certain fashion, we fashion ourselves as appropriate gendered subjects. In other words, in Butler's terminology, an expectation produces the very phenomenon it anticipates, which is sort of a little bit mind-blowing if you ask me, because she says that performativity works by anticipating a gendered essence is repeated over time to solidify into identity. A so-called internal feature, and I'll have you pay attention to so-called, is produced through bodily acts. The body itself performing in the world, everyday existence, produces something that you think is intrinsic to you. However, this is neither voluntary nor does it take away from questions of agency, and this might be difficult to understand, because if somebody is performing, doesn't it mean that they have something to say in the process that you can choose? This is where post-structuralism or post-structural feminist theory conflicts with liberal feminism, that we do not have choices. We are formed through structures of power, and gender is a structure of power. At the same time, it's not that we don't have agency or capacity to act in the world, it's just that it is limited. I know that in many ways this is a lot, so please remember that this is merely an introduction to Butler, and we will revisit this in the week on post-structural theory. I just thought it might be interesting to introduce it at this point to tell you what's coming ahead. So this is a little bit of a teaser campaign. At the same time, I find post-structural feminist theory to be some of the most exciting theory in this field, and therefore it's something that all of us should necessarily engage with whenever we can. Just to give you a little bit more of a taste of what Butler says and writes, and if this is something that you find difficult, hang on to that thought. We will be reading a large portion of Gender Trouble, the book I'm quoting from, a few weeks into the course. Here, speaking about gender, she says, the view that gender is performative sought to show that what we take to be an internal essence of gender is manufactured through a sustained set of acts proceeded through the gendered stylization of the body. Here's another important thing to remember. The body is very important to Butler's theorization. It's not located just in language. It takes into account bodily presence in the world vis-a-vis gender. In this way, it showed that what we take to be an internal feature of ourselves is one that we anticipate and produce. Remember anticipation, Kafka, and produce through certain bodily acts at an extreme, a hallucinatory effect of naturalized gestures. I find this quite a lovely turn of phrase, hallucinatory effect, as if in many ways gender is something that we are hallucinating through in the world. Hang on to that thought again, because these are imaginative theoretical gestures. They are there for you to play with, to be able to really think about gender as not natural. And just to give you a little taste of how such theorization may be extended into other forms of difference, the text also asks you to see class as performance. Here by text I mean Christina Hugh's chapter on difference and not Butler. How do people understand their class identities? Sociology, anthropology, the social sciences will have told you that class is about socioeconomic capacity, which is not false. However, in relation to feminist theories of difference, we are looking at class as not just material location, but also as performance in a similar fashion as Butler and gender. In other ways, can you identify people's class if they don't tell you how much they earn or how they've been educated or what levels of education they have? Aren't there certain facets of performance that also seem to come hand in hand with material benefits? And therefore, you also have the notion of passing or the notion of class mobility, where people modify their speech, their clothes, their comportment, their manner of bodily being in the world to seem to be of certain classes or to gain upward mobility. And in this instance, class as an important facet of identity is both a makeover and a takeover. You make yourself over in the image of something that you anticipate people are going to expect if they want to see you as a particular class subject, and your identity is also taken over by these expectations. Therefore, in relation to class performance or the difference as part of class identities in feminist theory, we ask how do people understand their class identities. Here, we are looking at materialist forms of post-structuralism and complex and contradictory ways of understanding class difference, not merely based in material wealth. I already mentioned the notion of passing or class mobility, but in relation to the materialist form of post-structuralism that we are speaking about, it's important to remember that such passing or such mobility has material consequences. It's not merely about identity as a fashionable thing. It means that certain kinds of wealth will come to you if you are seen as a particular kind of class subject. Think, for example, about ways in which people have to appear in job interviews. What kind of class background, what kind of educational background. It will not matter if your certificates say certain things, it will matter that you are evaluated to be of a certain class by the person sitting opposite you, interviewing you. And like we said, identity as both a makeover and a takeover is particularly important, because here we are talking about forms of injustice perpetuated depending upon how you are perceived in the world. A brief sort of looking through sexual difference. Here again, if we start thinking about it through Butler's theory, we are saying that sexual difference is institutional and symbolic. Now, I wouldn't have you worry about these terms too much. By institutional, we mean that they mean something to particular kind of institutions such as family, state, so on and so forth. And here's a controversial claim that one can claim one's sexuality outside of the imposed norms of heterosexuality. Now, this is a difficult one for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, because again, heterosexuality is considered to be the norm in society through which we reproduce ourselves, and many theorists and writers are arguing very strongly for the fact of sexuality itself to be an identity-based claim that can be dismantled. And this is what they are suggesting, that we must change how we are sexed and claim our personhood at the same time, that it's possible to be sexed differently than heterosexual society demands of us, and we can still be full persons in society. The last form of difference I want to delineate today is under the category of the postcolonial, which is involved with critiquing colonial and imperial modes of representation in Western feminist work. This is particular to feminist theory because a lot of people writing in this vein have argued that political identity in a lot of feminist writing is focused on the global north and does not take into account the ways in which gender has been inflected by the post-colonial experience. By this I mean countries that were formerly under colonial rule and the ways in which their gendered subjectivities were influenced by such forms of imperial rule. In post-colonial difference, we look at a cautionary retention of a unified political identity, say women in India, women in South Asia, women in Sri Lanka, women in Bangladesh, so on and so forth, even as there is an emphasis on multiple local differences. In other words, women in these countries are claiming that women of the global north do not speak for us, and writing from the global north does not take into account differences of post-coloniality. Such writing also argues for the political significance of the diaspora as a non-normative community. Now, you will see this very often with theory. Theory is interested in things that don't quite fit into normal categories. Diaspora is such a non-normative community, carrying culture from one place, being able to speak about life experiences in another, and having markers of all of these on their subjectivities also leads to different accounts of gender, which theory claims is very important in trying to understand how is it that feminism should move forward. One of the examples that the text gives in relation to the slippages of colonialism is related to Australian women in England who one might ostensibly think would enjoy the same benefits as British women, but this is often not so because of the kind of class and cultural differences seen to be borne by Australian women even as they look the same as British women. And this is an important case study to illustrate such an account of post-coloniality, even though Australia is not within the general pantheon of the post-colonial. Quick recap again: post-colonial, third world, post-national, global are the multiple names of the school of thought. The forms of difference that they speak about are differences between third world and Western women, differences between diasporic and migratory communities. Such a school critiques Western othering and imperialism as found in Western cultures, even as it retains a concern with the political and cultural usefulness of some aspects of a unified identity, provisionally, strategically, in some contexts as opposed to others. Its politics are specific and local, and some illustrative writers are Chandra Mohanty, Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak and Avatar Bra. In conclusion, at the end of today's long lecture, which I imagine has been quite a lot, we looked at 5 conceptualizations of difference: different but equal, identity-based differences, post-structural and postmodern difference, sexual difference, post-colonial difference. Let me emphasize again that there are significant overlaps between all these forms of difference. They are heuristic tools. They are not meant to constantly speak about erasing the other. It's not that you can't use all of these together if you choose, and these are models for thinking and not absolute categories. With this, we come to the end of lectures for week 2, where we went over conceptual clarity, equality and difference. Next week, 2 different sets of concepts as we move further along. Until then.